Hey guys, hope everybody's doing all right. So today we're going to move on with our graphing of sine and cosine. I'm going to start doing a little bit of some amplitude changes and as well as period changes. Okay. So just to kind of start off, any kind of standard form for your sine and cosine, right, is going to look like that. Okay, so today in this lesson, we're just going to focus on the amplitude and the period, which you get from the value that goes out front. And then the period is the number that is next to x, okay? And then in a different lesson, I'm going to do horizontal shifts and vertical shifts. Okay, so remember amplitude that is the distance that you go away from the principal axis. Okay, and then the period is the length of one cycle. And it's also the number of cycles that you have in 2 pi. So number of cycles in 2 pi, okay? Now amplitude is pretty straightforward. You're literally just going to be looking at the number that's in front of your function. And then the period, you're going to take 2 pi and you're going to divide it by what that b term happens to be, okay? And then that'll tell you how long one cycle should be, okay? So when we're looking at this first one here, right, I have 2 sine of 3x, okay? So I'm going to pay attention to the 2 and then also the 3, okay? So the amplitude I know is 2, okay? So I'm going to go up to positive 2 and then negative 2. And then the b term here is going to be 3, okay? Now, to figure out my period, I'm going to take 2 pi and just divide it by 3, okay? Now, I can't simplify that anymore, so I'm just going to leave it as that. So one cycle here is going to be a length of 2 pi over 3, okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to do 3 cycles, and I'll show you what that would look like. So you should draw out your axis first. Okay. Now you're going to go up to positive 2, and you're going to go down to negative 2. So you should put that on the y-axis. Okay. And then your x-axis, what you're going to do is you're going to take 2 pi over 3, right, which is your period, and then to come up with your interval, how you're going to do your x terms. Okay. So your interval, okay, which I'm going to call the letter I for interval. You're going to take your period and you're going to divide it into 4 sections, okay? This will help you label your x-axis. It'll tell you how much you're going to go up by each time. So in this example, we're going to do 2 pi over 3 and then divide that by 4, okay? So if I simplify that, I get 2 pi over 12 or pi over 6. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up by pi over 6 each time. Okay, so if I start there at 0, right, then the next one would be pi over 6. Okay, and then the next one would be 2 pi over 6 or pi over 3. Okay, and then the next one would be 3 pi over 6 or pi over 2. Okay, and then the next one would be 4 pi over 6 or 2 pi over 3. Okay, so if I start at 0, again, one cycle is going to put me at 2 pi over 3. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do one cycle after 2 pi over 3, and then I'm going to do one cycle before 0. Now the ones before 0 are just the opposite, so you're going to go down now by pi over 6. So negative pi over 6, negative pi over 3, negative pi over 2, and then negative 2 pi over 3. Okay, so now I have 2 cycles there. Okay, and then I'm going to do one cycle now after 2 pi over 3. Okay, so 2 pi over 3 I know is 4 pi over 6. So then the next one would be 5 pi over 6. 6 pi over 6 would be next, which is pi. 7 pi over 6. And then 8 pi over 6 or 4 pi over 3. Okay, so right now I have three cycles on my x-axis. Okay, now you guys need to make sure that you remember the acronym for, because we're doing sine, right? It's going to be Sahala. Okay, so that tells me that I need to start on my axis and then go from there. So you have axis, then the next one is going to be high, and then axis, and then, let's go back. So we said that the amplitude was 2, right? So pi over 6 should be at positive 2. And then you have axis, and then pi over 2 should be low at negative 2, and then 2 pi over 3 axis, okay? And then you're just going to keep going through that cycle. So 5 pi over 6 is 2, axis, low, axis. Okay, and then you're going to do the same thing in the other direction, okay? So we would have axis, high, axis, low, axis. Okay, so once you guys have your points, then you can just graph it. Okay, so it's going to come up, come back down, all right. You guys want to make sure when you're doing these that they're not just like straight lines, like they need to have a curve to it. Okay, and then there at the end, I'm going to do an arrow, and then I'm going to do an arrow down there, okay? So that would be three cycles of the sine graph, okay? A lot of these, your graphs are going to look very similar. The big thing is you need to, your x terms, what your x-axis looks like, that's going to be the key. That's going to be the big thing to look for. Okay, so the next one, we're going to do cosine. All right, so again, I'm looking at 3 and I'm looking at 1/2. So I know that the A term is 3, all right, which is my amplitude. And then the B term is 1/2, okay? So for the period, I'm going to do 2 pi divided by 1/2. Which if you simplify, 2 pi divided by 1/2 is 4 pi. Okay, so one cycle here is going to be 4 pi. And then my interval, right, I'm going to do 4 pi divided by 4, and that's going to give me pi. All right, so this one's going to be a little bit easier to do the axis for. All right, so draw your x and y. Excuse me. So you're going to go up to 3 and then down to -3. Okay. And then your interval is going to be pi. Okay, so you're going to go up by pi each time. So 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. Okay, so that's one cycle. And then I'm going to go one cycle to the right, one cycle to the left. So make this a little bit longer. So you have 5 pi, 6 pi, 7 pi, 8 pi. All right, so that's 2 cycles. And then negative pi, negative 2 pi, negative 3 pi, negative 4 pi. Okay. All right, now we're doing cosine now. Okay, so cosine, the acronym for cosine is Chahala. All right. Or Chala, sorry. Getting my acronyms mixed up. So this tells me that I need to start at my high point and then go to my axis and then my low point, axis, and then back up to my high point. Okay. So when I start at x equals 0, I need to start at my high point, which in this case is going to be positive 3. Okay. And then you have axis, low, axis, high point. Okay. So that's one cycle. And then you just do the pattern again. So high, axis, low, axis, high. Okay, and then you just go in the opposite direction. So you have high, axis, low, axis, high. And then you just draw your curve. Okay. So you come down. Okay, so that would be your 3 cycles for your cosine graph. Okay, so again, the biggest thing to find is your amplitude, your period, and then once you have your period, you can then figure out how much you're going to go up by every time. So I wanted to add a couple of extra ones on here just to throw in some like a reflection. Okay, what that would look like. All right. So here I have the amplitude is 5, and I'm also going to put that it's a reflection over the x-axis, okay, because of this negative that you have in front, okay? So that's just going to change our pattern a little bit. Now the b term is 2, okay, which makes the period is going to be 2 pi over 2, or 1 pi. Okay, and then my interval is going to be pi over 4. Okay. So again, draw out your axis first. Okay, so you're going to go up to 5, down to negative 5. Okay, so your interval we figured out was pi over 4. Okay, so pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and then pi. Okay, and then 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, which is 3 pi over 2, 7 pi over 4, and then 8 pi over 4, which is 2 pi. And then we got negative pi over 4, negative pi over 2, negative 3 pi over 4, and then negative 1 pi, okay? All right, now, so because we're doing sine, right, it's Sahala, right? So you're still going to start at your axis, right? But all of your high and your low points are going to end up switching. So if you wanted to, to change the acronym, if you don't need to, if you don't want, but you're going to still start at your axis, but instead of going to a high point first, you're going to go to a low point, and then axis, and then back to a high point, and then back to your axis, okay? So it just changes the direction of the points. So we're going to start axis, okay? And then instead of going to the high point, you go to the low point. So low, axis, then you go to a high point, and then back to your axis, okay? So you're flipping over the x-axis your high and your low points. Okay, so you have axis, low, axis, high, axis. All right, and then you're just going to draw your curve from there. All right, so that would be, see, it looks very similar, right? But some of the points have been flipped over the x-axis, and you're going down first instead of going up. Okay, and then the last one, we'll do a negative cosine. Okay, so your amplitude here is still 3, but this has a reflection. And then your B term is 5, which then makes your period 2 pi over 5. Okay, and then your interval is going to be 2 pi over 5 divided by 4, okay, which is 2 pi over 20, or pi over 10. Okay, so draw out your axis. Okay, you're going to go up to positive 3, down to negative 3. Okay, and then you're going to go up by pi over 10. Okay, so 1 pi over 10, 2 pi over 10, which is pi over 5, 3 pi over 10, and then 4 pi over 10, which is 2 pi over 5. So that's one cycle. And then, so you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pi over 10, which is pi over 2, 6 pi over 10, which is 3 pi over 5, 7 pi over 10, okay, and then the last one, 8 pi over 10, or 4 pi over 5. Okay. Okay, now for this one we're doing cosine, right? So we have chala, okay, for your acronym, all right? And then also because of our reflection, again, your high and your low points are going to change, right? So instead of starting at a high point, you're actually going to start at the low point. So this is going to be low, axis, high, axis, low, okay? Again, you're flipping your high and your low points, okay? So instead of starting at 3, I'm going to start at negative 3. And then axis, high, axis, low. Axis, high, axis, low. All right, and then I'm just going to connect the curve. All right, so that would be a cosine graph with a reflection over the x-axis. Okay. So if you guys have any questions, please let me know.